you very much, Suhail. Now, when I'm not writing music with Softwire, I work there as a technical principal, and as a consultancy, that means I get the privilege of working with a wide variety of different clients and a wide variety of different domains. But I'm going to talk to you about one of my absolute favourites, Anthony Nolan. Anthony Nolan are a stem cell donor registry. They save the lives of thousands of cancer patients every year by finding them matching donors. But what does it mean to be a matching donor? Why do we need them? How do we find them? And what lessons can finding them hold for StaffPlus engineers? Well, we're going to start at the very beginning with a story. The year is 1940. Peter Medawar, a doctoral student at Oxford University, is relaxing in his garden with his wife and daughter when suddenly they're startled by the sight and sound of a bomber flying low towards them. They scramble for shelter and make it just in time as the bomber crashes into a nearby garden. The pilot of the plane survives, but sadly suffers horrific burns in the process. The shock of witnessing such an event firsthand led to an epiphany in Peter, who dedicated the rest of his life to solving the mysteries of transplantation. You see, to treat the burns that the pilot had suffered, skin transplants were needed. But at the time, skin transplants from other people were rejected or destroyed by the body within mere weeks of transplantation. Doctors at the time assumed that this was just because they hadn't physically mastered the art yet. Their cutting and sewing wasn't yet good enough, but when they got there, these transplants would work okay. But Peter Medawar, who worked in a burns unit at the time, speculated that this wasn't the case. So he took it to the lab to prove his point. Now, I promise this is not a demonic ritual of any kind, but a demonstration or representation of Peter's experiment. He took 25 rabbits, and he painstakingly grafted skin from each rabbit onto each other rabbit in the group. And in doing so, he discovered two things. Firstly, like in humans, no skin could survive a transplant. But secondly, that a follow-up transplant from the same rabbit again degraded much quicker than the first time. But a second transplant from a new rabbit did not. I.e., these rabbits had developed immunity to specific other ones in the group, much like we develop an immunity to a specific strain of flu, but then still need a booster shot the next year. Now, this was a bombshell discovery at the time. It proved that the other scientists were wrong. No matter how much we improved our physical cutting and sewing, we'd never be able to solve the transplant problem without thinking about this immune system. But this leads to another mystery. How does the immune system know who you are? How does it know how to identify that this skin has come from someone else? Well, there's not been any tech yet for a tech conference, and I'm afraid there still won't be for another few minutes, but we'll get there, I do promise. But first we're going to fast forward just a little bit to 1958. A scientist called Jean Dosset. Now, he was mixing human blood together, as scientists are wont to do, and he discovered some antibodies in some of this human blood. And curiously, these antibodies would react with some, but not all, other people's. Now, he named this substance MAC after the names of the volunteers in his experiments, but it's become known later, and is still known to this day, as HLA-A2. This was the first discovery of an HLA. There are a set of genes present in the human genome, and they contain the blueprints for making proteins, which are a type of molecule found within the body. These specific HLA proteins are found on nearly every single cell in the body. And these are what the immune system uses to tell the difference between you and not you. Now, these HLA genes are incredibly varied. To demonstrate quite how much, could you please put your hands up if you have red or blonde hair? Now, those of you with your hands up have two variants of a gene called MC1R. This is considered a highly varied gene. There's over 30 different variations known among the population. Most genes that do have variations only have one or two. HLA-A, the gene which Jean Dosset discovered, has over 7,000 options. Now, this makes sense from an immune system point of view. If this is what our immune system uses to identify ourselves, if all humans looked identical, all it would take is one disease to morph to look enough like the human race to fly under the radar and infect everyone. So variety in these genes is useful. But knowing about this variety helps us solve the transplantation problem. Now, to avoid the immune system rejecting a transplant, we simply have to find a donor who looks enough like the patient, i.e. has the same or very similar HLA genes. I'm going to keep using HLA throughout the talk to represent these sets of genes. So Anthony Nolan was founded in 1974 to do just that. They were the first bone marrow donor register. See, blood diseases like leukemia can be cured, again with transplants, this time not of skin, but of bone marrow. And so Anthony Nolan collect up millions of willing donors across the country, stick them all in a database, and then run searches for their patients to find ones with matching HLA and facilitate life-saving transplants. And central to everything they do is matching. What they use for matching is Atlas. Atlas is the first open source predictive matching algorithm. And we can use the knowledge we just walked through of how the body rejects transplants to use technology to build something that seeks out those that won't be rejected. So what is a matching algorithm and how does it work? Well, we've talked about HLA genes. We've actually got quite a lot of them in the human genome, but it's been proven through scientific experimentation that only 6 of them really matter for matching purposes, that is. And they have a known property. We've got agreed upon nomenclature stored as strings, which we can compare to see if they are close enough that a rejection will happen or not. So why isn't this actually really easy? We've got 6 properties, they're strings, we can compare them. That doesn't sound complex enough to come and talk at a tech conference about. Now, the problem here is ambiguity. Now, we'd absolutely love it if we did have perfect information about the genes of donors and patients. Then it would be just as simple as doing those 6 comparisons. We'd have some data that looks a bit like this. This is a globally agreed upon nomenclature for one of those genes. But for various reasons, we don't actually have that data. First of these reasons is that while this technology does exist, it's quite new. Some donors have been on the register for decades, and when they joined, this technology wasn't available. And secondly, it's very expensive. There are tens of millions of donors across over 100 registries worldwide, and they're all charities. They don't necessarily have the budget to go and do perfect molecular typing on every single donor. So instead, what we have is data that looks a bit more like this. This is a convention used globally to represent a set of possible values. We've done some tests, and we know that it's going to be, in this case, one of these 2 values, but we don't know which. Now, this is all well and good when we've just got 2 potential values. But in the worst cases, we might have data that looks more like this, which has close to 500 different values. And so this makes our search difficulty very varied. In the best cases, we do have exact data, and it is just as simple as those string comparisons. But in the worst cases, we're having to boil down lots of ambiguity. And if there's ambiguity in our input data, that means we're getting lots of results back to process, sometimes as many as tens or hundreds of thousands. So Anthony Nolan scientists had determined this algorithmic logic. They'd put together the steps that we should follow for working out whether a transplant would be rejected. But this ambiguity problem means that it's a bit of a hard technical problem to solve after all. And so that's where we came in as tech experts. I led a team of a mixture of software and Anthony Nolan developers working together to build this algorithm in a highly scalable, highly performant way using the cloud. So what did we build? Well, to talk about Atlas, we have to break it down into its 2 major component parts. Firstly, we've got the matching algorithm, which is doing what we've talked about so far. We get a set of patient HLA in, and we want a list of donors who might be a match. Now, we've talked about how the difficulty of doing this varies quite a bit depending on the input data. So we've embraced Azure's serverless offering. We're doing our compute in Azure Functions. And for our lookups, we're using good old SQL, but in this case, we're using Azure serverless again, so that we don't have to provision an incredibly high-spec database for our worst cases, but can just scale up only as and when we need it. We get the elasticity for difficulty. And then finally, this gives us our list of results. But not all donors in this list are created equal. You recall that each individual gene, we might know it's one of potentially 500 different options. If only one of those options is a match for our patient, we still want to know about them. But if all 500 are, that's clearly going to be a better match and more likely to ultimately be able to be a good transplant. So what we do is we run it through our second algorithm, match prediction. Now, this is going to be taking some real-life known reference data from people we have invested in getting perfect information about, and using this realistic snapshot of the population to work out how likely each match is going to be. So we get our list of results. Again, we're using serverless for this. This time, we're running a piece of analysis on every donor in our set of results. So we're using Azure's durable functions, which comes with a handy fan-out, fan-in pattern, so that we can run all these analyses in parallel. They're all completely independent pieces of analysis. We don't need to run them all on one machine. But what do these analyses actually look like? Well, jumping back to our first algorithm for matching, we could search at each gene independently. Let's say we've got genes called A, B, and C. There's some ambiguity at each of these genes. Well, we can run 3 SQL queries. We can find out which donors would be a match at A, which would be a match at B, and which would be a match at C. And then do a union at the end to find those donors which are in all 3 lists, and that gives us our first list of results. For match prediction, it's not quite so simple because we're talking about real-world reference data. But it turns out that these genes aren't completely independent in the real world. They're located right next to each other on the chromosome in our genetic code, and they're quite linked together. Some of them are much more likely to occur together in certain groups than others. So instead of considering A, B, and C independently, we now have to consider A, B, C as a set. And so this means taking our ambiguous data from before and expanding into all possible combinations. With those combinations, we can then look up how likely those specific combinations are based on real-world reference data, weight it by these probabilities, and then we can just do a simple calculation of comparing all the patient options to all the donor options and working out how many of those matchups are a successful match and how many aren't. And that gives us our overall percentage value weighted by likelihood. So that's in a nutshell how the algorithm works. We built this, we put it together, we'd had it verified. It ran through all of our acceptance tests. We worked with Anthony Nolan scientists and confirmed that it passed every edge case they could throw at it. We'd even run performance tests against Anthony Nolan's 2 million donor data set. So we're feeling pretty pleased with ourselves. We're proud of our architecture, it's held up, we're ready to go live. But there's one final hurdle on the path to going live. We need to run some performance tests against what is called the WMDA, the World Marrow Donor Association, who are an organization that group together all donors from all registries around the world. And they have a set of tens of millions of donors. And when we ran our performance tests against their examples, we got a nasty shock. Now, it wasn't just that we were running too slowly, as you might expect for performance tests going wrong, but we were actually falling over entirely. Now, we went and had a look into our logs to find out why, and we found we were running out of memory. If you recall, we were expanding to all possible combinations. In some of these worst cases for ambiguity, there were too many combinations, and we ended up not having enough memory. So we've got a simple problem and a simple solution. Let's just get some more memory, right? We could up our service plan in Azure, or we could give up on serverless and provision some hard drives ourselves. But I hear some of you thinking maybe we could be a bit cleverer. We're actually plugging all of this into a big reduce function, essentially. Could we just take, say, 1,000 of these results, process them, get our work in progress for our percentage, move on to the next 1,000? Then our memory issue goes away altogether. We only need as much memory as a single batch. But we've already been bitten once by our performance tests being much worse than we thought. We thought this was going well until we got our hands on that global dataset performance tests. So rather than diving into either solution, I wanted to have a think about the theoretical worst-case scenario. So let's take our example genes again, A, B, and C. These are what are called the class 1 HLA genes. And just to clarify, these aren't letters I've made up to demonstrate a point. These are the actual names of these genes. If each of these could have one of 500 different options, if A is that is fully ambiguous, we're having to do 500 lookups. If A and B are both fully ambiguous, we're at 250,000. If all three are fully ambiguous, we're at 125 million. That's not too bad, but we don't stop there. You'll recall earlier I said that there were 6 genes that matter for matching, not 3. So we have to worry about the class 2 HLA as well. Now, for reasons that I won't go into, one of the 6 doesn't actually play into this particular calculation, but the other 2 very much do. And here it becomes obvious that I didn't make up these names. When you plug these 2 into our equation, we're looking at 10 to the 13 different options. But we're not even done yet. You might know that for every gene in our genome, we have 2 copies, one from each parent. So we're actually not looking at 5 lookups, but 10. And for a transplant to be successful, both copies need to be a match, or the immune system will reject it as before. So when you plug in these additional 5, we're up to 10 to the 26. Now let's think about our memory problem. Let's assume that each set of genes takes 1 byte. It's on the small side, but it'll do for a demonstration. We're looking for 10 to the 26 bytes. Now, a gigabyte is 10 to the 9. A terabyte is 10 to the 12. A zettabyte is 10 to the 21. And the largest SI unit there was at the time we built this was a yottabyte at 10 to the 24. And we're 2 orders of magnitude above that. In fact, it's been estimated that all of Earth's data, all the data, is measured only in zettabytes. So something's gone a bit wrong here. Clearly, we can't just ask for more hard drives. If we got every hard drive in the world, it wouldn't be good enough. And for our cleverer calculation, where we don't worry about memory, sure, we wouldn't need a bigger hard drive, but we're still doing millions of different calculations it's going to take a long time. So instead, at this point, we have to ask ourselves, why? What are we doing here? And in this case, what are we doing with this data? Well, we're looking up all of these combinations in our reference data and then plugging it into our calculation. We're looking it up in our reference data that we have on a hard drive given to us by Anthony Nolan. Now, unless Anthony Nolan have made great strides in hard drive technology and not told the world, I don't think they're using yottabytes of data for this. Or let's put this a more theoretical way. There are 8 billion humans on the planet. They've each got 2 copies of each gene. That's 16 billion records. So if we had a reference data set that was comprehensive, every single human there was, we'd only need gigabytes to store it. And just to clarify, we don't have that kind of reference data. We've only got tens of thousands. And so clearly something's gone wrong in our thinking. So the solution here isn't to get a bigger hard drive, or indeed to be clever about the calculation we're doing, but to flip the problem around and look at it from the other angle. We've been implementing this algorithm in order as we've been given it by the scientists, step 1, step 2, step 3, but there's another way to the same result. If we look at it backwards, we can work from our reference data. Rather than expanding to all possible combinations, doing a lookup for each one, most of which will result in 0 because it's not there, instead we start with our reference data and filter it down to only those values that would be expanded to. And so we go away and we implement this. We run our tests again, and they make it to the point they'd previously fallen over and don't run out of memory. They keep going. So we've done it. We've solved the final hurdle towards going live. So we celebrate. We go out for a drink, come back the next morning to see if the results are the same. And when we come back the next morning, it's still running. In fact, it's still got a long way to go before it's finished. So we're not out of the woods yet. There's another final hurdle to go. So we're not crashing anymore. That much has been solved. But we're still taking hours to process every donor in our list. And in the worst cases, there might be hundreds of thousands of donors. Now, in terms of where this time is going, well, our reference data set's got tens of thousands of results in it. You pair them up for the 2 copies of each gene, you're into the millions. We're then comparing all the options of donors and patients. Pair those up, we're into the billions. And it's those comparisons, no matter how simple each one is, when we're running billions of them, that's taking our time. And so what do you do when your code isn't running fast enough? I admit what I did was try to make the code faster. So I jumped in, I started optimizing, I locked myself in a room, hacking away, and I got it from 5 million comparisons every minute to 10 million. 2 times increase in speed, but it was still taking 2 hours for every billion calculations. And there's only so far we can take this approach. Even if I made it another 10 times faster, we'd still be taking 10 minutes for every billion calculations. This is all for one donor. We need to be done with the whole search in minutes. So at this point, I stop optimizing. Probably shouldn't have started in the first place. And think, surely this is a solved problem. Like, we're no longer in the realm of ludicrous amounts of data. We're not in the nonillions anymore. We're in the mere billions. Surely people have solved this before. Maybe we can turn to big data. Clues in the name. So I started thinking, should we look into Apache Spark or Hadoop? And sure, it'll involve re-architecting our solution and starting again on a lot of points, but I think we can solve this problem. But we're going to have to invest a lot in it. We're going to have to do all of this investigation, and then even running these searches is going to be much more expensive than it was before. So we once again find ourselves, instead of implementing, taking a step back and asking, why? Well, to understand the why in this case, it's useful, I think, to jump forward to the end user. What are we doing with these results? Well, we're sending them to search coordinators. What the search coordinators are doing is looking at a list of donors, deciding which ones to follow up with for transplantation. I've got a slightly blurry, I'm afraid, version of what they actually see. This is HLA-A. They can see the donor's 2 values and a percentage chance of a match. They see the same for the other HLA, and most importantly, a single percentage chance for that donor, and a little bit of extra information. They're just going to be performing relative comparisons for these donors in this list to decide which are the best few to follow up with. So with that in our mind, let's jump back to the code. Well, we're having a look at these billions of calculations, and they're all being plugged into a probability calculation. And so we have a look at the probabilities involved. We find that they vary quite a lot. They actually vary by 10 orders of magnitude. Now, if you've worked with probabilities, you'll know that summing probabilities that vary over 10 orders of magnitude means that those lower orders of magnitude have to work unfathomably hard to have any impact on the final result. Only the top few orders of magnitude are really doing anything. The lower ones are just giving us precision. But think back to if you're a user and you're comparing these relative positions in a list, do you care about the difference for one donor being 80.003% versus 80.865% when the donor you're comparing it to is 50%? Probably not. So I postulated that maybe, rather than finding the tech to run all these calculations quicker, we just shouldn't be running them at all. But this time, unlike our first problem, we're suggesting an actual change to the algorithm. We're not just reframing it anymore, we are removing some of the precision. So before implementing again, I went to talk to the head of bioinformatics at Anthony Nolan to confirm that I hadn't made some grave error and really this was going to mess everything up. So I walked into his office, held my breath, and got told, actually, yeah, we do this all the time. He confirmed, yeah, this analysis is correct, and that these sets of genes specifically follow what is known in statistics as a heavy-tailed distribution. And he said to work with these genes in a meaningful way, they regularly cut off the tail and only focus on those that are most impactful to the calculation. So with a new spring in my step, I went back and implemented it, and finally, we're fast enough. We've got through the second final hurdle. And this time, it was the final hurdle. So Atlas went live in 2023 and is now running live searches against that global donor dataset. So what have we learned from these technical problems? Well, we've learned to flip the problem around, look at it from another angle and see if you can get the same result from another way. We've learned to be prepared to trade precision for speed. Sometimes precision is important, but often it won't be. And finally, we've learned that the solution isn't always a technical one. In both of these cases, if I dove in and kept on with the naive technical implementation, we'd have never gone live. We'd have either never solved it, or we'd have made too many trade-offs on things like cost to make it. So, is this actually what we've learned? Like, none of it's untrue. This is all stuff that I'd stand by. But if the solution isn't often a technical one, I think the same can be said of the takeaways. What have I actually learned from this and put forward into my future work? What do I want all of you to take forward and put into your work? It's not this, unless you're working on very specific problems that are much like these. What have we really learned? Well, whether you work in retail, or whether you work in aviation or finance, or HLA matching for Anthony Nolan, when we're building anything with technology, it's vital that we understand what we're building and why we're building it. Understand your domain. And this isn't just for senior engineers. It's our responsibility as seniors to ensure that everyone on our teams knows the domain they're building in and can understand why. And if we understand our domain, we can ask the right questions. Now, this comes in two forms. Firstly, don't get nerd sniped. If someone comes up to you with an impossible technical challenge, I know how tempting it is to lock yourself in a room and come up with an impossible technical solution. And you might just get there as well. If you do get there, it's all well and good, but as we saw in our example, we might have to make too many trade-offs along the way, particularly cost. And the second iteration of this is don't let the impossible put you off. If someone comes to you with an impossible technical challenge and you say, that's impossible, we're not doing it, again, you'd never make it live because that would be too big a hurdle in your way and it would kill the project. But if you know the right questions to ask and you understand your domain well enough and you can ask why, you might see that that impossible technical solution isn't the only way round, and there's another way to the end value you're delivering, whatever that may be. And for Atlas specifically, you might ask, how did we get as far as we did before discovering these problems? Surely we should have had NFRs up front. We should have been testing this all along, and we should have been confident in these worst cases before we wanted to go live. And looking back over it in a project retrospective, we had thought about it. We had NFRs. We ran performance tests against what we've been given as the worst cases for ambiguity at the time. It just transpired that the worst cases for that global data set from WMDA were much more ambiguous than we thought possible. And so if we'd have had a good understanding of HLA matching all along and been willing to ask the right questions and ask the question behind the question, we could have had that conversation earlier and said, right, we've done a bit of reading into HLA matching, and we think the worst case could actually be quite a lot worse. Can we have a conversation about whether that's possible? And sure, we'd have still had to come up against these roadblocks, but it wouldn't have been a surprise at the very end of the project. And finally, if the work that Anthony Nolan do is inspiring, you don't have to be part of a team building a matching algorithm to get involved. You can join the millions of people already on the register. And if you're not in the UK, there's registries like this in nearly every country. There's over 100 of them worldwide. There'll be an equivalent. But the transplantation story that started over 100 years ago with Peter Medawar, that's been assisted by Atlas running in the cloud, could ultimately end up with you saving someone's life. Thank you very much.